record. Now we're recording. Okay. All right. Before we get going, there was, I think, I can't remember now. Pamela, I think it was you, but I can't remember. Caught me out on a mistake that I made with the links for notes. And what happens is when we set up a class on Moodle, the way I do it is I just import everything from the previous iteration and then start rewriting because I'm almost always revising something. But what I forgot to do was go in, it's a little incremental thing, but you got to go in and open those things up. And I think you set them to something like always open or, whatever, rather than open for 7 days or whatever. And I didn't do that and they closed. So I apologize. And that's probably why only 2 of you have filled out notes. So I'm going to leave that open, a little longer. One of the things we need to talk about today, and it depends on how much we get done today. I think we can get all the presentations done today, but we may not. If we don't, obviously we'll delay the first written assignment until we do. That's not that big a deal. But it's better if we don't. So if we finish the assignments, and unless there's some real profound concern, finish the assignments, the presentations, the first written assignment would then be due on Sunday, I think it's the 18th. The link in there for the Module 1 assignment is visible. Yeah, Sunday the 18th at 11. Okay, so start making plans for that. Understand that, you're going to have to. The first assignment's pretty easy. All I'm really asking you to take any 2 of the sources we've talked about and essentially summarize them and explain how they contribute to our understanding of terrorism. Now, obviously, everything that we're going to hear in the presentations is kind of leveraged on that. Okay, it's not just a summary, but it's like, this is why people trying to analyze terrorism might want to have a definition or might want to know whether something is new about terrorism than used to be the case or whatever, or at least might want to be aware of the controversies over whether or not there's a link between poverty and terrorism or something like that. Because these are areas in a lot of cases where there's no consensus. Hence the perennial smirk of political science, because most of what we deal with is not obvious consensus kind of stuff. If it was, we wouldn't study it. There would be no need to. Okay, so are there any questions about class format, expectations on the assignments, any of that kind of stuff before we go into the presentations? Because once we get into those, what I'd like to do is depending on our pacing, try to do the first 2 and then maybe take a 5-minute break, get away from the screens, get up, move around, and then come back and do the last 2. Does that make sense? Yep. Yeah, okay. I think it'll be easier for us to do them all in one go if we give ourselves a little breather about halfway through the class. Okay. Then I think what we'll do is just take them in order, and we'll start with the Saul article on defining terrorism. So you decide who's going to, if there are more than one. I think that's the only one we have where more than one person is presenting, I think. Yeah, so you can decide who's going to go first, how you want to arrange this. I don't know if one of you wants to talk about the reasons why we want to define it, and the other one wants to talk about what Saul says about what the elements of a definition should be, or however you want to divide that up. Whatever works.
I think I'll just jump in and have AJ correct me.
Okay.
Have some confidence. You got this. Easy. No corrections.
Look, I got coffee and terrorism. I'm in a good mood, so I'll take anything today.
All right. So basically the concept is that we need an agreed upon definition of and for terrorism, both nationally and internationally, because we need to prevent misuse by governments against opponents who would, let me restate this, to protect human rights violations, to protect against human rights violations. When you use the word terrorism, it kind of clicks in legal ramifications to your penalty and charges. And so if you don't know if you are a terrorist or not, the levity of what will be brought against you is going to be up or down. And I think that would be important to know. There's a lot of discussion about what aspects have to be contained in this word definition. Freedom from fear is bandied about. That seems to be unacceptable to some states and non-states because fear is sort of an amorphous thing to try to understand. I think the main gist of what they want to say is it's basically when there is a political aspect to the definition of terrorism that has to be included. And there is a difference between private violence and public violence. And it seems to be that the term terrorism leans more to the definition of public violence, either bodily harm, threat of bodily harm, fear of bodily harm, or the concept of making a corporation or government either do or not do something because they feel like they're being threatened or threatened with bombing or terrorism or kidnapping or hijacking or some such thing. So really, I think the national and international community both need to agree on a term of definition for terrorism so that it is clear who gets prosecuted, why they get prosecuted, and what they get prosecuted for. It kind of goes into some miry quagmires about, does organized crime fall into this? And the upshot of that would be they want to target people who are making money and filtering money in order to fuel their terrorism and to pay for their terrorism. But if you call organized crime terrorism, there's a differentiation between a moral issue and a harmful issue. And it goes into some really fantastic concepts about democracy is not actually mentioned as being the sole target of terrorism. A democratic government cannot be the only thing that terrorism is brought against. It can be monarchies, it can be dictatorships, it can be all forms of types of government. So I think I have a very Western point of view, and I think, oh, terrorists are threatening democracy, but we need to expand that to understand that all different types of government structures can be the threat of terrorism, and terrorism can be brought against that. So I'll stop babbling and let AJ correct me and Professor Hughes correct what I tried to get across to you.
I think you followed through the whole article and made points that the author made, but you didn't tie in where they were connected. So there's four main themes of the article, right? He starts off by explaining a little bit of background on the history of terrorism and why it's important to define it, then explicitly goes into the reason for defining terrorism, because it violates human rights, because it jeopardizes the state and deliberative policies. It's important to differentiate public from private violence when defining terrorism. Terrorism threatens international peace and security. I just have controlling Security Council measures. So that's more broadly, if you define terrorism, that you control how the US responds to terroristic acts, as opposed to the US just saying, this is the war on terrorism. You have a very clear idea of what they're going for. And then the final reason for defining terrorism is the incidental benefits, which were kind of just here's the other benefits on the side that were important. From there, the author jumps into current proposals for defining terrorism, and then basically just kind of shoots them out of the sky. We're working on it, but it's not real great. Mostly lackluster or missing key elements, and they're not generally agreed upon by the entire NIMASH community. And then the basic elements of defining terrorism, there needs to be prohibited means and methods, which the author outlines as serious violence. There needs to be prohibited purposes and aims. What are the motives and objectives of the terrorist organizations? There needs to be a threat to international security / international element. So truly domestic acts with only domestic purposes don't count as terrorism in many cases. Those would be considered civil conflicts of some kind, right? Like civil wars and things like that might include terroristic acts, but in general, that larger conflict might not have anything to do with terrorism in general. And then plain textual meaning. The acts need to create extreme fear. Basically lumping in international events that do cause fear, but that's not their goal. You have better ways of defining those. So stop using terrorism as a lump sum, all things that are seriously violent like this are terrorism, and instead use words like, political violence, assassinations, war, civil wars, as opposed to saying separatist groups, for example, are terrorists, speak of them as independence movements or autonomy movements. And then one interesting section at the end is the exceptions to the definition of terrorism. So this is specifically where the organized crime gets brought in, where independence movement gets brought in, where ethnic violence gets brought in, and trying to differentiate that public from private violence that Karen touched about at the end, which is a super big part of I think the definition of terrorism here is that private violence, like organized crime, the goal is not to strike fear into people. The goal is to make money or to corner a market of some way, right? Even when organized crime acts in a way that is threatening, right, with racketeering and stuff like that, they're not really aiming for political gains, which is a big part of the definition by the article, is that terrorism by its definition is public political violence. And then the very tail end is just like part of the moving towards the definition of the contemporary era of the article, which was 2006. So 15 years ago now.
Yeah. I every time I use this article, I think, gee, I need something more current. But it's just that Saul does a really good job of summarizing the moving parts of definitional terrorism. And between the two of you, you've done the same. But if I could just highlight a few things, maybe clarify a little bit. One of the things that Karen mentioned was that it was a comparison between, say, a threat to a corporation and a threat to a government. Okay. Saul seems to be suggesting that threats to corporations, while they might be really nasty and they might be really violent, are not terrorism. Because, and Karen, I think I misunderstood what you meant by that, but what I'm more concerned about what you said and how people might, if they're taking notes, might interpret that. If you go and boycott a corporation, that's not terrorism, okay? But even more importantly, if you go and destroy the property of a corporation because you don't like the way they do business, that's still, Saul would suggest, that's still not terrorism, because you're not really trying to affect change of the broader political system. You're trying to get that store to show a conscience, or you're trying to get that store to allow people to unionize, or you're trying to get that store to conduct its business in what you consider to be a more appropriate way. Now, what you do may still be, and this is, I think, what AJ was trying to suggest, it may still be criminal. Damaging property is a crime, just as damaging human life is a crime, okay? But Saul seems to think it's important that we don't conflate those two things as terrorism, okay?
Yeah, he said, he made a specific point about, he was really good about giving actual examples when he was talking about stuff. So he said, for instance, if you went and spray painted on the side of the Sydney Opera House, no war. Yes, that's a crime. You have committed, vandalism, but vandalism is not terrorism. And you shouldn't be arrested as a terrorist for wanting to protest a war on something or a treatment of some people or whatever that is. And he really does make the definition between that being your right to protest versus that being a terrorist act.
Okay, well, this is an interesting case, though, because it is clearly in its motivation political. You're trying to convince a regime to change. But where this falls out of the definition of terrorism, as Saul seems to conceptualize it, is the purpose of it is not to instigate fear or instability.
Right. Yeah.
It's essentially political theater. Okay. And it's, again, it may indeed be criminal, but he's concerned throughout the article that prosecuting non-terrorist activities as terrorism is a violation of human rights. It's going to bake into particularly a repressive system, but not necessarily only, obviously, repressive systems. It's going to bake in a kind of government justification to shut down anything the government doesn't approve of. Okay. And that's one of it. When he's talking about violations of human rights, that's his concern. Yes, terrorism is a violation of human rights, but suppressing the right of people to express themselves politically is a violation of human rights as well. And so the challenge of defining terrorism is to criminalize certain things as terrorism because they meet these criteria of extremism, of serious violence, of transformative political motivation, and of actual, damage to persons and property, rather than any one of those. They have all of those elements, So it's a very juridical, very legal notion of terrorism that he's trying to come up with here. Okay. So are there any questions on that first article? Again, it's old, but I think it still works. And until I find, sorry, go ahead, Karen.
I had a question on page 16. He talked about maintaining moral symmetry. The use of violence as a way of maintaining moral symmetry.
Let me
And
get to page 16. Stupidly, I'm not in the article.
That's okay.
Well, because if I start, what happens is I've noticed I start reading, and as soon as I start reading, I stop listening.
Right.
It's hard for me to do both things, but let's see. It's toward the end of the article, and I remember him. Let's see. Help me find where that is.
Exceptions to the definition of terrorism. It's on
Okay.
that same page, and it's the last paragraph of that page.
Where terrorism is committed in peacetime or in situations not covered by the IHL in order to maintain moral symmetry. Okay. The notion of moral symmetry is that, as he intends it here, is you maintain and enhance the legitimacy of the system when that system responds to actions, whether or not you're in a time, say in a time of war, that where possible, okay, you want to treat a crime as a crime, okay, and terrorism is terrorism, and it isn't supposed to necessarily depend upon whether or not you're in so-called peacetime. That's and the reason I know that is I'm looking at the reference there, and I'm vaguely familiar with that. Again, it's a kind of legalistic argument that trying to say the law should be even-handed. It's one of his concerns, his primary concern really in this article, and I think AJ pointed this out, and Karen, you may have done as well, I didn't catch it in my notes, was his fundamental concern about human rights. And that in pursuing terrorism, however justifiably, we run the risk of so circumscribing permissible action as to use the state to eliminate the very human rights that terrorism is attacking. Does that make sense? I don't know that I said that very elegantly. That, in other words, the punishment can't be worse than the crime, I guess is one way to think about that. And so this is a small L liberal notion. It's emphasizing tolerance. It's emphasizing legitimacy and accountability in the rule of law. These are small L liberal principles. These are not conservative principles. They're not Marxist principles or anything. They're moderate liberal, again, small L John Locke liberal kind of things, okay, in a sense. So does that make sense? Yeah, in other words, be even-handed irrespective of the larger context. And again, to be more precise, unless the context fundamentally defines the act.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's something that will emerge sort of case by case. We know, for example, that governments will often treat crimes committed in the midst of a demonstration where people can get swept up in the moment and they have righteous indignation and everything. Well, sometimes treat differently those kinds of crimes than they would if it was just somebody randomly going and breaking into a store. They're still going to prosecute looters, but they're not necessarily, if people are arrested for like throwing rocks at the police in the midst of a demonstration, they're probably going to be released on their own recognizance. They might be fined, but very little is going to be done. That's actually considered moral symmetry, because the idea is you didn't come out here to hurt anybody, okay? You didn't come out with the intent to go to war with the police in the street, as opposed to people who clearly tooled up, brought their weapons, went out there and said, we are ready to throw down. So that's the kind of thing, I think, Karen, that he means by moral symmetry.
Okay, thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. The article doesn't really stand or fall on that necessarily, but it is an important component of his sort of small L liberal notion of human rights. Because there are a lot of people who would argue that there's no such thing as human rights. That, you know, the only rights anyone has are the allowances guaranteed by the state. And so by definition, it's not derivative of your status as a human being, but only your status as a resident within a nation state. We can get into that in another class. I've been thinking seriously of teaching maybe the political philosophy class and dealing with that question of human rights and whether or not such things really exist, whether or not human beings actually have any rights at all. Might be really interesting. I didn't feel like this was a really good time to do that. So what do I do instead? Political violence. All right. Any other questions on this article? It's pretty straightforward, but it's lengthy. The argument is accessible, but it's complex. There are a lot of moving parts to it. Okay. So these kinds of summaries should, if you haven't done it already, should help you kind of frame the notes that you enter, you know, in your journal entries on the Moodle page. And then from those, you should be able to decide which pieces you want to summarize and how you want to go about doing that. And keep in mind what we just did here. We began essentially with a summary from Karen, and then AJ built on that summary, contextualized it in a framework, and then explained kind of how it relates to the study of terrorism. Okay, so that was a very well done presentation. That's kind of what we're looking for. Okay. If there are no other questions, then shall we move on? All right. What about the question of whether or not terrorism is or is not new? Where do we want to go with that?
Okay, so yeah, it was an interesting article because it kind of countered the first article we just went over, just because that was all about defining terrorism to me. And this one was saying that it's really hard to define terrorism to a lot of scholars, which I'll get into that a little bit more later. But the article was basically two viewpoints of two authors, Spencer and Gunaratne, I believe.
Not bad, not bad.
And kind of focusing a lot on Al-Qaeda. So I'm missing the year the article was published. Do you happen to know? I didn't see it.
It's fairly recent. I think it's 13, but I would have to look.
Okay, cool.
Sorry.
I was just kind of curious before I got started. So basically the background that I summarized from reading the article was that terrorism is constantly evolving, and it wasn't a radical break from old terrorism versus new terrorism. And so I guess in the 1990s, early 1990s to the mid 1990s is when people kind of decided to start looking into old terrorism versus new terrorism, and if that's actually a thing. So this whole article is about if there is such thing as old versus new. And so that's the two viewpoints of the author. So Spencer is more focused that new terrorism is not a thing, and Gunaratne believes that it is new, so that new terrorism is an idea. So with the question, is there such thing as new terrorism? It dates back actually as an old phenomenon as terrorism is. So in the 1700s, terror was defined as a policy to protect the fragile government in the post-revolutionary French Republic.
Okay, can you just, I'm sorry to interrupt, but that's a really important point. And that is that the original notions of terror applied to actions of the state that were necessary. Okay, see how the difference between, well, the state's going to terrorize you, but we have to do that, you know, to keep the 17th century carts running on time, kind of thing. Okay, just so everybody understands that. Sorry, I apologize for interrupting.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah. And so as I get into how I mentioned earlier, it's hard to divide by scholars, which I thought was interesting from differentiating from the first article. But basically, it's defined in this article as the use of violence against non-combatant people for political purposes. So that's pretty similar to me. It's an evolved term, and through organized violence is what it said. And it's national liberation, territorial succession, and ideological revolution. And then I also had a question here on this. So it said one who can identify with the victim of the attack is terrorism, but if one cannot, then it's not terrorism. And I kind of was confused by that, if you want to elaborate.
I'm trying to be quiet here as I type. Let's come back to that. Put a pin in that one and go on with the rest of your presentation, but then remind me to come back to that.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. And so, like I said, terrorism is an old phenomenon. So I've got notes here that said it dates back to AD 66 and 73. from Sicarii. So the Sicarii, and which is a Zealot Jewish group against the Roman rule, was an example that the article provided, as well as the Ismaili and Nizari, the Empire of Saladin. Sorry if I'm pronouncing these wrong.
It's not bad. You're doing okay. You're an American. You're doing the best you can.
So these are terror groups, and the environment is an important factor in the motive and influence for those. So I have traditional terrorism as old terrorism. It's another way to describe that the article mentioned, and then versus new terrorism. So traditional terrorism, they mentioned, started way old days, but also they talked about the 1960s, while hostages, skyjackings, and out of area attacks became really popularized, as well as the Palestine Liberation Organization that affiliated to traditional terrorism. And then the new terrorism began to come about from the 1990s. So it was more focused on religious motivation, maximalist demands, which I wrote down as a person who holds extreme views and they're not willing to compromise, which I didn't know. And then they're focused a lot on mass casualties with motives, tactics, and organization. So they're a lot more focused on ways to kill with like not really thinking about, I wrote it down here, but more mass casualties and no like empathy at all, versus old terrorism was focused less on mass and just smaller casualties. So I wrote down old is going to be, the casualties will be low. There's secular motivations and rational political reasons. So the new terrorism has less to do with political reasons, as it says here. Is that correct?
Not exactly. But that needs some clarification.
Okay. So I have a lack of political agenda and political demands for the new terrorism, versus old terrorism is more of a political.
Again, you're not wrong. It's just that that needs to be fleshed out a little bit. In other words, if the demands aren't political, what are they?
More religious.
Okay, so the idea is that whereas historically the demands were largely political in nature, new terrorism is sort of post-political. It has to do with regionalism, insurgencies, religion, things like that. And remember that what Spencer's arguing is, if you go back and look at the Zealots or the people that are Saladin, the assassins and people like that, they were a combination of political and religious because those two things could not be separated at that time, right? That's the point he's trying to make there, in case that didn't make sense.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Okay, so then I'll just go over kind of my notes more of the new terrorism here, moving on from the political agenda, but it's more of a justification over morality. So that's kind of what I was trying to get at earlier, but I lost my train of thought there. So it's justification over the morality, that there's justification for the mass casualties, versus old terrorism was more on the low casualties and not focused on the justification for that. And there was no morality in the new terrorism.
Okay, let's stop there a second. I'm sorry. If new terrorism, according to this model, now you're still, sometimes I'm lost because I'm not sure if you're still on Spencer or if you're combining the two articles. Because Spencer's article critiques the model of new terrorism. It's actually two different essays.
Okay, I took it as one essay together.
Yeah, I mean, they're written by different people sitting in different rooms, obviously having different perspectives. But one of the things that Spencer is trying to get at is, if new terrorism is more religious, then other people say, oh, and it's amoral or immoral. Well, most people look at religion as a code of morality as much as anything else. And it begs the question then, how can new terrorism be amoral if it's disproportionately religious in nature, as opposed to old terrorism, which at least allegedly was not religious? Okay.
Okay.
So let's do this, because I think people are going to get a little confused, and you've got a difficult task here. Let's see if we can streamline it. Let's start with Spencer first. Okay, he disagrees with the distinction between old and new terrorism as being meaningful, right? You pretty much said that. We've got that. He gives you the model. He says, well, supposedly new terrorism is this and this and this. Then he goes on to dismantle that definition and show how it really doesn't hold. Okay. And so if you go to his conclusion, you know, he's trying to say, look, terrorism isn't fundamentally organized any differently. Its motives aren't fundamentally any different. And, you know, its methods aren't even all that different than they were in the past. Because what he's saying is, right, you can't just go back 50 years or even 100 years. You can go back 1,500 years. And terrorism then looked a lot like it does now. Right? That's kind of his point.
Right.
You
Yeah.
got that part. Now, that's good. What now? Gunaratne is countering that. He's not sharing that view. How is his view different? Because he's suggesting, no, there are meaningful new differences, new things in terrorism that we've never seen before. Right?
Right.
And what are those? What's different? He lists them on page 17 for those of you sort of following along at home.
Okay, well, I had new as the religious view, and then that it lacked political agenda and the political demands, which you weren't so sure of. But that's what I read, so I don't know on that. But there's the excessive violence, the destruction of society in large sections, the good against evil, no negotiations, illegal sources of funding was ways of how they can get through. So drug trafficking, video piracy, and credit fraud.
Okay, but if you go to page 17, what he starts with, and this because it's about context. See, Spencer says it's about context. You've got to look at the whole sweep of a couple of thousand years of history. And what Gunaratne says is, yeah, you got to look at context. And at the end of the Cold War, the context changed dramatically. And he gives you 4 ways in which the context changed and terrorists adapted to that contextual change in terms of the methods, the motives, the aims, the objectives, you know, whatever, okay? And those are important. So if you don't have those, I'll summarize them when you're done. But if you do, that's because, again, the argument here is a lot about context. It's a lot about the time period within which things happen. Okay? So tell me just the essence of Gunaratne, because everyone else can read the article. You don't have to do all their work for them, but what's the key difference between what Gunaratne is saying and what Spencer said? Because their views are very different.
I mean, that's the notes that I have. I wrote down that Gunaratne believes that it happened post-Cold War, that there was a shift from the Soviet Union ending in 91, that the left wing diminished there.
There, that's
that
good.
important.
That's what I meant. That's what I was looking for.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's see. So I just have quite a bit of notes. So there, I guess that he also categorized in 5. So the left and right wing, the ethno-political, the politico-religious, state-sponsored, and single issue.
Mm-hmm.
Which I was a little bit confused what politico-religious is.
That is it's an inextricable linkage of politics and religion. In terms of a political system, it would be a theocracy. That is, it would be ruled by religious principles. And this is politics pursuing religious principles. Whereas the modern, and that's a fair point of confusion, by the way. I'm sure you're not alone there.
Okay.
The idea is that sort of the modern nation state system is what's referred to as secular. That is, it's not about religion. Religion is a private affair, and it's left to private individuals in the privacy of their homes or their organizing places, their synagogues and churches and things like that, right? But when you fuse into a political, religious, or ethno-political is another fusion. When you fuse into those environments, you link those two things together. And Gunaratna, as you point out, is arguing that's different. That's old terrorism was about fighting industrialization or, fighting repressive governments or whatever. This is about moral systems and religious values and things like that. So you're not wrong. I mean, I want to make sure, because I'm kind of watching everyone else's expressions and thinking, I can kind of tell there's a thing that people do when they're getting it, and there's a thing that people do when it's like too much information.
Okay, sorry. I guess my notes are a little confusing.
No,
but-
you have Bill Hughes disease because you see the value of the detail, but forget sometimes that first you got to create context. That's the only, and I do the same thing, as many of you know, if I'm not careful. So if let me do this a little differently, because this is a complicated argument and it's really better done with two people. The basic difference then, as you've pointed out, is that Gunaratna is saying that with the demise of the bipolar world, that global context of Cold War, at the end of that, okay, the world changed fundamentally. And the way that it did that was first of all, a lot of places where we used to not be able to go, we could now go, okay? But we also had access to information, because that was right about the time, early stages, but very quickly, the internet emerges, access to visibility of the rest of the world creates new opportunities for people to recruit, to influence, and to terrorize, okay? And you pointed some of that out, okay? There's accessibility to weapons. One of the consequences of the Cold War was to create of the entire developing world competing armed camps. The largest weapons supplier in the world is the United States. But right behind them in the Cold War was the Soviet Union. Okay, and so the Cold War was driving the superpowers to arm very heavily, and by the way, for very lucrative profits, all of these post-colonial developing countries by way of drawing them in, either to the, to the Eastern Bloc or to the West or whatever, right? Okay, well, when that's all gone, you still have all those weapons, and you still have the political cultures that were built on those weapons. So you have all these repressive states terrorizing their own people, okay, creating localized grievances, okay? And Gunaratna says this is new, this idea of internal conflict driving terrorism rather than transnationalism, he says is new. On page 17, he says, a shift from international to internal disputes, especially ethnic and religious. Once you take away that bipolar oversimplification of left-wing and right-wing, or communism and, liberal democracy or capitalism, all of a sudden we now can see more clearly ethnic differences and all these dislocations, that many of which were created or caused by the Cold War, right? So he's saying the world changed and terrorism changed with it. That would be the point there. And you got us all the elements, but to tie it together, what Spencer says is, no, if you go back far enough, the world goes in circles in that sense, right? In other words, a lot of the motivations for terrorism now that Professor Novak was just discussing were very much the drivers of terrorism in the early, first millennium after Christ, where you had the Zealots and you had, the movements around Saladin and things like that. Those were religious movements, and you know what? Their conflicts were localized. So all the criteria, Spencer's arguing, all the criteria that Gunaratna says make terrorism new, the adaptations of new terrorism, really, those things have been with us on and off for centuries. Okay. In other words, he's not saying, and either his conversation, not saying that, well, we didn't talk about nuclear terrorism 1,000 years ago or even 100 years ago, and we do now. Keep in mind, we've never seen it. Okay. People talk about it. We've never seen it. And so, yeah, there may be some new methods. I think you talked about drug trafficking and a couple of other things.
Yeah, with the new technologies.
Right, new technologies.
Technologies
Sure.
and
And new ways
advanced
of building
weapons.
IEDs and stuff like that, biological and chemical weapons. Spencer has a response to that. People were doing that 2,000 years ago. If you poison a well in a village and let people know it's poisoned and they magically start dying, you're trying to terrify them into getting the hell out of there or changing. You know what that is? Biological warfare. It's as old as the species. It really is. So that's really the point there, that Gunaratna is saying, no, man, it's a different world. And you're right, you have to point out, the post-Cold War world is very different for the West in particular than was the Cold War world, okay? And it doesn't just look like the pre-Cold War world. In other words, the world now doesn't really look like the world in 1935. In some ways, it looks like the world in 1535. I think that's what Spencer's trying to say. Does that make, see, you were implying all that, but you had all
No,
of this
thank you.
stuff.
That's
Yeah, I
a
think,
good summarization.
I'm sorry.
No, that was a good summarization. Thank you for helping me out here.
Yeah, but there again, this is an example of where you have all the information and then the next step is, it's kind of like what AJ did. See, having two people working on it allowed for that interplay where, you could have Karen come out and say, okay, this is the basic landscape we're dealing with conceptually. And then AJ could come along and say, yeah, but let's tie it all together. If you're doing it by yourself, it's harder to do. But when you're prepping for your presentation, that's the step you want to try to make. You did some of that, but, and I think you did a good, remember, these are the first presentations too. So everybody's kind of learning as we go. So I'm not concerned and you shouldn't be. I thought that was effective. Now, does anybody have any questions about that piece?
I wanted to ask if one of you can clarify what was stated around the 1700. I don't know if I took the information wrong, but she said something about state performing terrorism or using terrorism for something.
Yeah. Do you want to take that first? And
Is
then
that about the 1794, the terror? That came
well, that's after that's the culmination of the French Revolution, but it actually goes back to the
record of the
1600s, the
terror. Okay.
17th century.
So
It's the same thing.
66. Is that what piece I'm talking about? Sorry, I don't want to like.
Yeah.
So for the record of terrorism that I wrote down, it began, so like old terrorism is an old phenomenon. And so it began in AD 66 and 73 as far as we can date back. And then there was groups that like prove that. So the Sicarii, which is a zealot Jewish group against Roman rule.
Mhm.
And then also another group that they defined was the Ismaili and Nizari, which was the empire of the Saladin.
Saladin, yeah.
Saladin.
I think what Madeline was asking about though was the sort of 17th century stuff and the idea of the state being the one carrying out the terror. Is that what you were asking about?
Okay, I don't.
Yeah, and you had a little bit of that when you talked about the terror after the French Revolution. Okay, it was that idea that when people use the word, when it started to show up in history and things like that as a terror or a period of terror, it was almost always associated not with the Zealots or with the Nizari or anybody but like that. It was normally associated with a monarchy trying to restore order after a period of instability. That's all that really meant, was that the term terrorism or terror historically was first really associated with monarchies, but let's just say with governments taking action against people rather than people taking terrorist actions against a government. Does that make sense? That's all that really meant. Yeah. And I think that was in Spencer's work. Spencer's is a very, very good, quick 40,000-foot overview of the history of terrorism. It really is useful. It's one of the reasons why, again, it's not a brand new article, but I've kept it in there because it seems to function well. Yeah. Any other questions there? Now, let's see. There was something that you asked me about. And I can almost remember it, but the harder I try to think about it, the more evasive it becomes.
That's okay. Okay, so the article mentioned, it says one who can identify with the victim of the attack is terrorism. But if one cannot identify the perpetrator, then it's not terrorism.
Okay, whereabouts was that? Because I need to look at it. And I kind of
I
know what
don't
you're
have
talking
the
about.
actual article up. I have my notes up, but
You have a page number. That's all I need.
maybe we
On
can
page
chat about
4?
this later because I don't have the article up, but I have to search for it.
It's on page 4, first paragraph, I think. Yeah. If one identifies with the victim of the attack, then it is considered terrorism. But if one can identify with the perpetrator, it is not.
Right. That's the point there is it's not the terrorist who's doing the identifying. It's the analyst or interpreter. Okay. It's the one person's terrorist and another person's freedom fighter.
Gotcha.
Okay. And, it's a terrorist if your sympathy is with the victim. But if your sympathy is with the person carrying out the violence, it's a heroic act of freedom.
Okay.
That's what that meant. Yeah. And I couldn't place that because I kept
That's okay.
farther into the article instead of the first paragraph, like anybody with a brain would have done. Okay. Maybe I need more coffee, but that's all that was. Yeah. In other words, it's building on the same perspective that Saul is trying to get us to use, which is a lot of this depends on the kind of lens you're looking at this action, through which you're looking at this action. If you're sympathetic to the victims, then you're going to want to punish them. And one good way to do that, you call them terrorists. And governments have been doing that for 200 years. So that's what that means. Anything else? I like this too because both of the arguments are fact-based. They're not excessively opinionated. They're different perspectives, but it's not like they're choosing selectively their own facts. They're both arguing in good faith. And you sit them at a panel in the same room, they're going to find common ground. And Gunaratana is going to tell you, I'm not saying there are no similarities. I'm focusing on the ways in which terrorism has obviously evolved and adapted to new conditions, which is what you were talking about before, right? Spencer's going to say, fine, but that doesn't make the phenomena we associate with terrorism new. They're as old as settled societies, because settled societies are perfect targets. Okay. All right. Let me very quickly. My system's running real slow today. I apologize. I think it's because when I'm online with this, it makes my system run slower. It's doing harder work. Okay, so we got the two left. Poverty and terrorism is very much like this one, where there's a yes and a no. There's a pro and a con argument. Terrorism legitimacy in the international system is a very complex argument, okay? And it helps to have a background in the study of international relations and foreign policy and things like that. If you've done some work with Dustin Walcher, for example, then you're loaded for bear to take that on. For some of you who don't have that background, we got to make sure that we're clear on the concepts we're using and what the Westphalian state system is and things like that. So what I suggest that we do, we're doing really well, I think, but I still think we should take a break. You think just 5 minutes? Let's see. I've got 2:20. Just turned 2:21. So let's come back at sometime around 2:25, 2:26, somewhere in there. Just 5 minutes. Get up, move around. I'm going to get some more coffee, and then we'll do those two arguments. I think so far, though, for what it's worth, I'm really happy with the quality of the presentations. They're going quite well. All right. So I'll see you in 5 minutes. All right, now we're recording again. And let's see. Okay, I think everybody's back. Everybody's screen's going. All right, so next is this question of terrorism legitimacy in the international system of states. Let's go down that road and see what happens.
Okay, I'm gonna try not to mess this up. I do not have a background in international studies, so this was awful. But I think based on the first two articles, and you guys' presentations, I think I have a much better handle on it than I did at the start of this class. So fingers crossed. I'll give you like a flyover kind of all of my notes. And sorry if I'm like looking all over. I have both screens and just trying to keep it all straight. But the one thing that was helpful was the abstract of this piece was like very well laid out. And so at the very least, I could use that as my model. So that was helpful. But so the very first thing is it kind of right from the gate starts with the definition of the Westphalian state. Is that how you pronounce it? Okay. And so basically she starts off the piece by talking about how the Westphalian state has kind of replaced like three really crucial sort of types of authority that had existed before, which was religious, personal, and local. And so it was like stepping into that frame. And so then she kind of hits us with her large overview of like the entire piece, which is going to be distinguishing between like terrorist organizations and like a different type of group based off their legitimacy claims. And so she's going to be going into the different types of legitimacy claims and what they're rooted in throughout the piece. And that's going to kind of be where we get to at the end, but it's going to take a little bit of information in the beginning. So she kind of starts basically, sorry, I'm trying to, it's a lot of information to synthesize, but she kind of starts by talking about how like this change into like modern terrorism, like what she would call modern terrorism, is super affected by like the international and the global system. And so she kind of starts off by talking about like the first wave of modern terrorism being after the French Revolution. And she specifically cites the invention of dynamite as like the start of the new wave of terrorism. But so like post French Revolution, they kind of were like like anarchists were like one of the primary types of like anarchist terrorism was the big sort of evolving thing that was like post French Revolution. And so basically like this was driven, I believe, by there was two basically like radical but mainstream movements that were, and it was rooted in egalitarianism and nationalism, and those were the promoters for this like post French Revolution like new wave modern terrorism that was that was happening. And so there was like that was kind of what was happening. And so basically what was kind of going on was that I'm sorry, I get a little caught up in myself, but basically, so there's a couple things that sort of hold the sovereignty of the modern state up, and it's like centralized, secular, rational, objective, and universal authority that's bound in space and particularity. So like people of one creed or kind and like location, and then obviously sharing those beliefs is kind of what holds the modern state together. And so then this was like all crucial to understanding the modern state, to understand this sort of scale that she illustrates for us on the legitimacy claims and where you fall in like this scale of terrorism to more of like not self-interest, self-determination groups. And so like there's different areas, and she lays it out through her scale. And so she kind of starts off, and I'm just going left to right because that is where my hands are. But so she kind of starts on the one end is competing claims to legitimacy. So like a competing claim to a legitimate authority within a modern nation. And then down on the other end would be personal authority / freedom. So it's like you're going from a competing governmental claim to like a personal / religious freedom being the other end. And then in the middle, in that gray sort of area, is where the religious claims fall into it. And so that sort of is the scope of those claims of authority. And it's like that is, and obviously she goes into more detail, but that was kind of the big 3 points that she lists out throughout there. Do you need to cut in? Oh, okay. Sorry. I saw your hand. I didn't know.
I'm just saying, I didn't want to interrupt, just saying, remember, it's a flyover. You're doing fine.
Okay. Yeah. And so that was kind of it. And then basically, the kind of things that she's touching on after she's laid that out toward sort of as she brings it to a close is that the international system that's now sort of becoming like has become prominent with like global existence
and the fact that there is this international connection, sort of, it basically means that it kind of, this international system doesn't give revolution that like utopic glow that it used to have. And so where it used to be like revolutionary leaders were like, the streets will be paved with gold, now it's like, well, the whole world is against us. So it's not just like me against Bob who's sitting in the palace. It's like everyone is behind Bob who's sitting in the palace, and I have one gun and 6 people standing behind me. So like it's kind of tricky, because even if me and my gun manage to make it in there, then I have the entire UN who's going to come after me. Anyway, that's a horrible analogy. Don't use that as your frame for understanding. But that was just how it helped me understand it a little bit. But so that's kind of what's happening. And so then her final like line was very, very powerful, very drama. If you did read it, I hope you enjoyed it. But like she was like, when Al-Qaeda is destroyed or absorbed, like another is going to take its place, and that will be terrifying. And I was like, damn, okay. So that was cool. But she was like, basically, Al-Qaeda is either going to be absorbed or it's going to be destroyed. There's only 2 ways that that can go. And then basically to fill that vacuum of what Al-Qaeda is doing is going to come another thing. And then I just have one other thing to go over really fast, just on that sort of topic, which was that essentially I'm trying to find the thing. So a thing with the Al-Qaeda was that it could be very well sort of compared to the anarchist terrorism, which doesn't totally work on this global structure. And so she gets into talking about that with national terrorism validates the global structure, because if you're having national terrorism, you're basically acknowledging that this government is like, that's been installed is legit, and you're acting in terror against this nation. But international terrorism in the international global sort of like concept doesn't work in the same way, because in the same way that Al-Qaeda doesn't have necessarily like, they're anti-establishment, and so it's not like they have a list of demands that can be met. This is a thing that often will come up when it comes to international terrorism, because rather than having a proposed set of fixes for one specific state, it is not like that. It is rooted in being anti-establishment, which isn't a demand that can be met by a global system. And so basically she kind of just says that anarchist terrorism in this global state comes to nothing because of the way that I kind of was explaining it before, and that because they're rejecting all state authority over like the individual, they're not going to be able to find that like success in the international state. And so that's kind of ties back to her whole thing about how Al-Qaeda is ultimately, her prediction is either going to be destroyed or absorbed, and then another one will come to fill that terror sort of vacuum. And so I think that's kind of the flyover. I hope I didn't mess anything up. So
No, I don't think so. It's a very, very dense argument. However, Aisha Zarqal is one of those people I discovered relatively recently. And it's like you get these kind of intellectual crushes on these scholars where it's like, oh, can I just like read all of your stuff? You're the coolest. And her primary concern is the whole, remember we've been talking a lot about context, you know, when Kambri was talking about whether or not terrorism is old or new, a lot of that was an argument about context. When we're talking about how to define terrorism, a lot of that is about context. What she's arguing is the way to understand terrorism is within a specific context. And that context is the international system of states as a global regime, widely recognized as legitimate, okay? And so she says essentially that terrorism, as we understand it, tends to take on roughly 2 forms. And one of those forms is a terrorism that recognizes the legitimacy of states, but wants to control them. You know, that is, think of that as an insurgency. In other words, I don't want to annihilate the legitimacy of the nation state as a concept. I just want to control this one. So if you think about, for example, like the Viet Cong, for example, who were an insurgency in South Vietnam, right? Or the Viet Minh in Laos or whatever it is, right? But think Southeast Asia. You had all these insurgencies. They were radicalized. Oddly enough, all of them, including the Khmer Rouge, were radicalized by people from their countries who had gone, and most of them had gone to France. They had encountered all of these radical ideas that Zarqal was talking about as characterizing that first wave of terrorism, of revolutions, right? The French Revolutionary fervor, Marxism, all these kinds of things. And these relative elites brought that back and then tried to inculcate that in peasants, okay? Because most of these were peasant societies, right? They were agricultural communities. They were very decentralized and everything else. The notion of the nation state is the tendency toward centralization, okay? And so part of this is you can either fight against centralization and fight against the legitimacy of the state, or you can fight to control it. Okay, and if you're using terrorist tactics to do that as part of an insurgency, you're more likely to enjoy success because you're not questioning the fundamental legitimacy of the state system. So when Quinn was talking, that was what she was talking about at the end. That's one kind of terrorism, okay? And it's inspired by that revolutionary fervor, initially, that revolutionary fervor in many cases of the mid to late 19th century. Industrialization was a big part of that. The notion of capitalist states and things like that. All those things are important. There's another kind of terrorism, though, and this is the terrorism that we might have described as new terrorism in a way, and yet it reaches back to that very, very old terrorism of the Zealots and the Nizarian people, like that, organizations like that. And it's this idea that, look, this centralized system of nation states who control legitimacy, and in that Weberian notion of the state, they have the monopoly of coercive violence, and they're fundamentally instruments of repression, right? That needs to be destroyed. And so what we're going to do, and she uses the example of Al-Qaeda, we're going to capture territory, take it away from the international system of states, and create this pan-Islamic caliphate. Or as Joe Biden said this morning, caliphate. I think he said, the guy's hopeless. I mean, come on. He's not that much older than me, but he's a dithering fool. There, I've made fun of our president, and it's been recorded. Oh, well, it has to be done at least once. But anyway, that represents a fundamental challenge, not to just one sovereign state, but to the legitimacy of the whole system of states, okay? And that, she's arguing, is the most radical kind of terrorism, the most dangerous kind of terrorism, because it threatens the stability of the entire international system, okay? And that's why she argues that these transnational organizations like Al-Qaeda are so dangerous and are looked at with such horror. It's not that their tactics are any more violent or anything else. It's the goal, which is to annihilate, the international system of states and the presumption of stability and order that imparts, and having a central state that can allocate resources and use its monopoly of coercive violence to maintain order and all that. That needs to be annihilated because it's also a secular system. And so remember that the Treaty of Westphalia came as a resolution to the 30 Years' War in Europe. The 30 Years' War was fought largely over whether or not sovereign states would be allowed, with the breakup of the Holy Roman Empire and everything, would be allowed to choose which state religion would be theirs. In other words, which religious source of legitimacy for their monarchy or whatever would they be able to choose, rather than having that come down from the Pope or something like that. Okay, well, people fought war over that, not so much because of religion, but because at that time, religion was the most powerful force in society, okay? It was the one source that was seen universally as legitimate, fairly universally. So the essence of this article is she's arguing, first of all, very, very much as one of our predecessors argued in our readings, there is a new terrorism, and that new terrorism is antithetical to the system of nation states. That's different. Some of its origins come out of that anti-industrial capitalism anarchism of the 19th and early 20th century. Because anarchists, the fear of anarchists, this is why people fear anarchism in the United States, because it challenges the entire notion of the United States as a legitimate government. Okay. It's a drive to decentralize and to localize authority and to predicate an authority that's based on something other than, Republican form of government and, a central authority and a rule of law enforced at the barrel of a gun. That is, there are different ways to conceptualize the human community in its proper state, and the nation state doesn't fit that. That's dangerous, is what she's arguing. Does that make sense? It's a complex argument, but it's a powerful one. She has also, I think, the virtue of writing well for a scholar. A lot of these scholars don't write very well. She writes really well. And I kind of appreciate that after years and years of reading really mediocre writing from scholars, to find a scholar who she presents very well. She's very compelling when she presents her findings, and she writes like a demon when she's on a good mood, you know, and clearly here she is. But it is very sweeping in its scope. It is, as Quinn, I think, implied, kind of overwhelming to wrap your brain around. So what I'm trying to get you to think about is there's a level of simplicity at which you can make sense of her argument. And yet still do justice to it, which is the distinction between mobilization that might include terrorism, but that recognizes and reinforces the legitimacy of the international system of states, and terrorism that attacks that directly. Okay? And that, she argues, is the new terrorism. So she would agree with Donato that, you know, yeah, there's a new terrorism, and it involves, you know, overthrowing this international system of states that's essentially been with us since the end of the 17th century, that it's fundamentally transformative. It seeks to transform the entire world, or at least it purports to, it claims to. One of the critiques of her argument for a lot of people is, and I might be in this school as well, is, yeah, that's what Al-Qaeda said, you know, that they wanted. But when you dig into Al-Qaeda, what you find out is, first of all, and we'll get into this later, they're not nearly as sovereign as they appeared to. Of course, they're not nearly much of anything now, but at the time she's writing, Al-Qaeda was not, I mean, they were heavily dependent on capital from another nation state. And they were actually helping that nation state, whether they intended to or not, they were. There is a compelling argument for that, that they were essentially used as kind of mercenaries, okay? That they were being manipulated by people within the sovereign, the system of sovereign nation states, okay? But in addition to that, when you look at the rhetoric and symbolism of insurgencies and terrorist organizations and everything else, a lot of them use very effusive rhetoric. But when you get down to what the motivations of the leadership are, they're often very different. And I'm not sure that her argument really drills down deeply enough. It is very much a 40,000-foot flyover of terrorism. And in that sense, I think it's compelling, and I think it belongs in this class. But you could critique that. You can critique that on a number of levels. But I think she might be overestimating the articulated symbolic intentions of organizations like Al-Qaeda, as opposed to the actual on-the-ground motivations of the people involved in it, and more importantly, of the leadership. They want power for themselves. If they could get it by controlling a nation state, they'd do it. You know, that's the critique of it. Now, it's an open question as to whether or not that's a fair critique, but just by way of kind of thinking about it, there are ways to come at that. But I still think it's an interesting piece. And Quinn, I know it was a difficult piece, but I think you did a very good job of summarizing it. So don't beat yourself up on that. It's just a lot. It's a very complex argument, okay, on a certain level. Are there questions about it? That's one that I think some of you are going to struggle with. But I still, please at least take a go at it. Try to read through it. And you might even want to, you can, you know, maybe get this video going, and if you just wanted to, like, you know, scrub ahead to where this starts and listen to Quinn's summary and this discussion, I think it'll really unlock that for you. You're going to see terrorism differently. You're going to see the whole notion of the international system of states as being imperiled. One more thing I'll say about that, and then we'll go to our last presentation. The big fear, the really big fear behind January 6th in the mainstream media, okay, was, and Rachel, I'll get to you in 1 second, but I was afraid I would lose this point, is those people don't recognize the current state as legitimate. And they don't even recognize the current system of states as legitimate. These tend to be people who are very localized, very parochial in their views, okay? And that's not disparaging, that's a fact on the ground. Their idea is that authority rests at home, hence the emphasis of the Second Amendment and things like that, okay? These are people who are largely motivated by a rejection of the legitimacy of the American national state, Okay, that's really dangerous for a central state to cope with. And that's why, for all of their intensity and emotion and occasional violence, the summer disturbances that we saw around the country as a consequence of, the Black Lives Matter movement finally kind of getting up on its hind legs and getting moving, right? With the exception of Fox News, the media were not really horrified by those things. They were sobered by them, but not frightened in the way that they were frightened by January 6th, such that you'll hear everyone but Fox News refer to that as an insurrection. Well, you know what? It was. That's the point. They don't know it. They don't know why it is. CNN talking heads don't understand why the word insurrection fits there, but it does, because they're attacking the legitimacy of the American national government. Okay, and that's important. Does that make sense? And see, that fits in with this particular model of Zarakal, that, the most dangerous kind of terrorism is the one that threatens the system of states. Okay. Now, I'm sorry, Rachel, you had a question.
Yeah, I'm just gonna ask, like, for the more dense articles, like the one that Quinn just summarized, I was wondering if you have any tips on how to really digest them, because I always find myself, when I try to read them, I'll read a bit and then I'll realize that I haven't been absorbing anything that I've been reading, because I just get so overwhelmed with how much stuff there is.
Yeah, I do actually. What I've tried to do, and I don't have it in every situation, but most of these things have some sort of abstract. Okay, look at that abstract and get that under your belt, and make sure that, for example, if they're using a concept, that you might have to look that concept up. You might have to Google Treaty of Westphalia or whatever and find out what that means, right? But start with that. Sometimes it may not be a clear abstract in the formal sense, but the introduction, like if you look at Saul's piece, the introduction there offers a really good flyover of what he's trying to get you to think about, okay? And then you look for terms that you don't understand and look those up. Then what I would recommend that you do, fly immediately to the conclusion and find out, when they bring this in for a landing, what are they emphasizing? And if you get lost again, then you might have to start skimming. Like, this article is helpful, again, because she uses a few large headings and things like that to break things up. For every one of those things she's saying, like on page 2317, she says centralization and its discontents. What does that mean? Well, that's what I was just explaining, that part of this new notion of insurgency and terrorism is the rejection of the central state as a legitimate organ of redistribution and of repression, okay? So that's what I would really do. The other thing that I would recommend you do is, when you're going through these articles, make notes of what you don't understand in the little, the note journals that you're keeping. And then when we start class, ask me those questions. There's nothing wrong with doing that. And it might be that we spend an entire class answering questions about the previous module's readings or something like that. If that's what we have to do, that's what we have to do. And if as a consequence of that, you're thinking, well, now I understand that, shit, I wish I could redo my module 1 assignment, then as a class, you ask me, hey, can we have a redo on one of these assignments? And I say, well, is it going to give me better work? And you say, yes, it will. And I say, well, then yes, we will do that. Right? I mean, this class is not designed to punish you or make you feel stupid. Nobody in this room is stupid. Okay. But this is new information for all of you. Okay. And a lot of this stuff I didn't get a chance to swim in these waters, some of these, till I was in graduate school. That wasn't because it requires an undergraduate degree to make sense of this. It was because people just didn't teach me. And I learned, by the time I got to graduate school, it was like, somebody should have taught me this when I was an undergraduate. It would have made my life easier. Okay. So, there's no getting around having to use challenging readings, but take them apart in small bites. Everyone does that, including me, where you get into new material and next thing you know, you've read a page and you haven't retained any of it. With me, it's usually a paragraph and I'm like, what the hell did I just read? That happens all the time. We all get distracted. Somebody uses a verbiage we're not comfortable with or a concept we don't understand. But I keep my iPad next to my table when I'm reading through books and stuff of new material, and I'm looking stuff up all the time. So it's not just you, I do the same thing. I've been doing this for a long time, because what I'm looking at is some people use words in peculiar ways. You know, the 371 class that I teach, a lot of philosophers do that. They take a term that has a meaning and they capture it. They kind of hijack that word and give it some other kind of meaning. So, you know, it happens at every level. It's not just, does that make sense? Does that help at all? Okay. But
Yeah, definitely. Thank
don't
you.
try not to get discouraged. You know, the best thing to do is write down what you don't understand, move on to another one. If nothing, it's just, okay, I've lost here. I got this much and I got my notes there. Now I've got these questions here. I don't want to take any more notes until I talk to Bill or until we meet in class and do a presentation or whatever. Okay. All right. We've got one more to do. Oh, I'm sorry. Are there actually any more questions on this particular? Okay. Yeah, I think we're probably there. All right, then let's look at the arguments on what if any, is the connection between poverty and terrorism. Remember that the basic question here, in fairness, is not, is there a relationship between poverty and terrorism, but does poverty cause terrorism? That's the real point of dispute. No one's going to argue that poverty might be a contributing factor. But the real issue is, you know, when people are poor, are they more likely to be radicalized as terrorists? Okay, so let's dive into that.
The answer to that, based off of this article, is no. While reading this, it was really fascinating because I think that America focuses so much on what's going on here instead of what's going on around the world. So there's in the first page, it says President Bill Clinton said that the forces of terror and extremism feed on delusionment, on poverty, and on despair. But while reading this, it says that they give the example of the 9/11 hijackers, and they said that if one were to base an analysis solely off the biographies of these 19 individuals, one would have to conclude that the root of terrorism is not poverty and despair, but privilege, education, and opportunity. So this article really went over a lot of the different terrorist groups that aren't in America or on the Western side of things that we really know about. But it did talk about, it did talk about how poverty poses a serious threat to human life, and that it does cause economic distress, causes frustration and stuff like that. But does poverty cause terrorism? Not directly. Of course, it is a factor of it, but it doesn't. It's not one of the key causes of terrorism. A lot of the terrorists and terrorist groups try to have people who are educated and that can fit into their group well and like mesh well with everybody. So they wouldn't. They like train really hard and do all sorts of stuff, and it says that. Oh my gosh, sorry. It says that. So there are diagrams in here, and they're only from 2000 to 2006. So I don't really know if it has changed at all, but it says that the reason, so it shows a bunch of different places and like the poor states, like the poor nations. And they're saying in this article, it's saying that poor nations are less likely to have terrorism because terrorist groups thrive in high economic status because there's just more connections. It talks about having like here, it says that oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. It says that most of the places that have really bad terrorist situations are the places that are most accessible. So like that have planes and have other stuff that can help them get the point and it done quicker. And in other places, the amount of money that they make is about $2 a day when it comes to all of the poorer places in the world. So so it just talks about all the different terrorist groups, and it was kind of hard for me because there's a lot of like, I forget what it's called, but like FARC and like FAAT and like all sorts of different acronyms for certain things. But it says that yeah, so in the, oh my gosh, sorry. In the summary though, at the end, it does say that it does have a link to terrorism, but not a direct one, and that poorer nations are less likely to have terrorists than more economically stable places.
Okay.
Sorry. Oh my gosh.
No,
Okay.
no,
Yeah.
wait. What about Conrad von Hippel's argument that, yeah, it's an important cause of terrorism? What's the distinction here being she's looking at it a little differently than the previous article. She draws a slightly different conclusion.
Yeah, and the conclusion is that wait, what did you just say? Sorry.
Her conclusion is different from the article you just summarized. Okay, but I'm going to suggest, and I think you've already seen, she's actually looking at the question differently.
Yeah. As in,
because she's primarily looking at poverty as an opportunity for recruitment, right? And but right, this is consistent with your point, actually, that first of all, let's summarize what you've just talked about. The argument there is that if you look at the parts of the world where there's the most terrorism and the most active and sustained terrorist organizations and mobilizations, those are not the poorest parts of the world. They're just not. More importantly, when you look at the leadership of those organizations and you look at who founded them, those are affluent people. Because the argument is, and you kind of got at it, but the argument there is those are the people who understand what the stakes are and have the most to benefit. They have the most profound motivations for putting those organizations together. They also might have affiliations and ties by shared education or economic ties or something that can allow them to draw resources in. They're not isolated. They're more cosmopolitan often, okay? And they often have military backgrounds or engineering backgrounds or professional backgrounds. You know, you mentioned the 9/11 hijackers. Most of those people were engineering students and things like that. They were all affluent. They were all college educated. They were solidly well-off people, but they had grievances against the Saudi regime in part, and against the United States as supporting the Saudi regime, okay? That's not about poverty. Those are political grievances. Those aren't class-based grievances. So that's where the argument, as you suggested, comes from, is when you look at the poorest parts of the world, you find the least amount of organized, what they mean is organized terrorism. You might have individuals who will lash out and do something that someone might call terrorism, but they don't form sustained, mobilized organizations that can recruit people. They don't have access to and you were suggesting this, they don't have access to the resources. They don't have the organizational skill, and they're isolated, right? They don't have the connections outside of their own immediate circumstances. You know, if you think about, for example, the situation in Rwanda between the Hutu and the Tutsi, all right, that a lot of people wondered, why did not that lead to a permanent terrorist organization of one kind or another? They were isolated. The United States under Clinton refused to intervene. They wanted nothing to do with it. They could have intervened, okay? Other people might have wanted to support that. But in one of our earlier discussions, we talked about the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, okay? They persisted as long as they did and were as effective as they were because they had a lot of external support, okay? They had resources and their leadership was educated and their leadership was skilled. It wasn't a bunch of poor people. So right, you're right, that's your argument. So von Hippel, though, has a little bit different way of looking at the connection between poverty and terrorism. And her argument, right, is, well, maybe not the leadership, but when you talk about recruiting, It's a lot easier to recruit poor people because they're, like you suggested, they're more desperate, they're more frustrated, but they're more desperate than affluent people. Affluent people might be more frustrated because they believe they can expect more, but the more desperate people are going to be poor people. And if you can come along as you suggested, and you can give them a sense of, hey, you know what? This is going to give you a sense of purpose. It's going to give you discipline. It's going to give you guidance in your life. We're going to feed you. We're going to take care of your family. In fact, if you are martyred in the cause, we'll take care of your family. They'll never be poor again. And those are really good reasons for a poor person to agree to carry an IED into a restaurant and blow themselves up, right? That's essentially von Hippel's argument, I think, isn't it? It seems to me. It's a question of recruiting. They may not be the people who create these organizations. By the way, it's the same argument you see in any discussion of revolution. There was an extraordinary controversy in the late 19th century, early 20th century, really, over whether or not Marx allowed, in his revolutionary theories, allowed for peasant revolutions. Clearly, Marx did not. His argument was no. You're going to come out of the disaffected proletariat of an industrial capitalist society. Well, that doesn't explain the revolution in China, and it doesn't explain a lot of the post-colonial revolutions, and the, you know, that kind, or the anti-colonial revolutions of the middle of the 20th century, right? So that just as there was a question there, well, you know, who's most likely to be involved in revolutionary politics, you know, in these so-called third world or developing countries, it was almost always people who had been mid-level trained professionals. And so they were educators, they were low-level administrators, they might have been in the military, they had professional training, they had exposure to Western organizational methods, Western ideologies, they had exposure to Marx. Marx isn't indigenous to Southeast Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa. And that requires literacy, right? It requires education. And it requires a sophistication of thinking in the Western mode to make sense of, well, what the hell is this guy Marx really saying? Or what's Lenin really saying in his theory of revolution here? Well, peasants don't think about that. And impoverished workers living in slums and cities don't think about that. They're just trying to eat. Right? They're trying to keep their kids from dying. Okay. And so, and this is what I think you meant when you said that poverty causes frustration. It causes desperation. You don't have a lot of options. Okay. And so that's kind of where I think von Hippel would say it may not generate the leadership, but it sure is a good place to find the rank and file. Classic example of that, Boko Haram in Nigeria. Okay. The people who created Boko Haram were the religious leaders of the northern province. Okay, they don't want to speak English. They don't want any Western education. Boko Haram means, roughly translated, no Western education. Okay, that's not a peasant idea. I mean, peasant idea is, what do I need education for? I just need good farmland, right? These are elites. These are people who control people by controlling the institutions of education. The institution of education in an Islamic society is religion. And if you're controlling religion, that is your state. Okay? That's what Boko Haram is about. They're not insane, they're radical. Okay? But they're also themselves not impoverished. A lot of their rank and file might be. We found out a lot of them appear to be disaffected former Nigerian soldiers. They might be, disaffected Nigerian workers, who, in some cases, who left either the South or the West or the East and moved north, converted to Islam if they didn't grow up in Islam. But most of them grew up under Islam. They grew up really with more of their connection being to North Africa rather than West Africa, okay, culturally. So that's the argument here. The one argument, as you pointed out, is, well, the leadership of these organizations is almost never impoverished. But what von Hippel is saying, yeah, but the rank and file almost always is. Isn't that kind of the essence of those arguments? Am I wrong? in other words, that's a level at which you can make sense of complex arguments. And I'm not trying to oversimplify, but I'm saying, for purposes of where we are in the class right now, and given that this is an undergraduate, course, I got to be realistic about, like the international system of states or the complexity of a terrorist organization or an insurgent organization. The Viet Cong, for example, in Vietnam is a great example and also the Viet Minh, because the Cong were the foot soldiers of the Viet Cong were largely either relatively poor people who lived in and around Saigon, right? Because this was in South Vietnam. That big city drew them in, but they couldn't find employment. They were often involved in criminal activity because there was no other opportunity for them. They were, as you suggested, they were desperate. They were frustrated. Or farmers who were being preyed upon by this very, very repressive South Vietnamese government, this dictatorship that was financed and guided by the United States. Okay. But the people who created that organization and the people who created you think about Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh wasn't an ignorant peasant. Ho Chi Minh spent a lot of his time living outside of Vietnam, living in Paris, living in Moscow, visiting in China. He wasn't, he was from a kind of petty bourgeois background. He had education. He was literate. He was a very smart guy. He wasn't an ignorant, uneducated peasant who was desperate. He was an aspirational, idealistic revolutionary. And they don't grow that many of those anywhere. Okay, that's kind of the point, I think, that the people who create these organizations are an elite. And you don't find an elite coming out of grinding poverty. It's just not allowed. That's the thesis. Does that make sense? And again, with any of these readings, the point is not, do you agree with it? You can draw your own conclusions. What I'm concerned about is, are you understanding the points that they're trying to make? And can you kind of put them together, connect the dots, and make sense of them in terms of your own view of, either how to define terrorism or what motivates terrorism or anything else? Okay? Any other questions about this or any of the other readings? All right, now let me ask you, do you think by Sunday, including having the opportunity to meet individually with me, exchange emails or whatever, do you think by Sunday you will be ready to write your first paper, given that all you're doing, let me go back to the Moodle page, right? Summarize the main points of any two of the assigned Module 1 readings and explain how each contributes to our understanding of the phenomena associated with terrorism. Now, when I say any two, right, those of you who had the yes-no argument, that counts as one source. So you'd have to look at that. Okay, what does that article tell us? By combining the yes and the no of that, what do we learn from that? And then is there another article, even if it's not directly related to that, but tells us something else we need to think about when we're trying to make sense of terrorism? You don't have to, you're not responsible, other than, in your notes in your journal, you're not responsible for any but two of the four assigned reading sets. Does that make sense? Can you do that by Sunday? All right. What I'm going to do, all right, since, this doesn't give you a lot of time, we only have one class period really to discuss the readings instead of two. I'm going to give people an opportunity for a rewrite of that assignment if you're unhappy with it. Okay, if you do the best you can and you turn it in, and then, maybe you meet with me and we discuss it and you say, okay, I want to do a rewrite, then I'll give you the chance to do that. And but you're going to have to meet with me individually and make an arrangement to do that. You're going to have to take the initiative to, first of all, to try and figure out, well, what could I do better? What do I understand now that I didn't understand before? And then, you meet with me via Zoom, or we can exchange some emails, and then we'll have a deadline for you, and we'll do it that way. Now, you might do the first piece and you might be solid with it. You might like your grade and you might not care. That's fine. All right. So I'm going to leave the assignment up. It's going to be due by Sunday at 11 p.m. Okay. Are there any questions about the assignment? What I'm looking for? Couple of pages, You should be able to do this within 2 pages, maybe 3, depending on how complex the readings are. Remember, what I'm not looking for is, you know, a cradle to grave summary. All right, what I'm looking for is the key points in that article that teach us something about how to understand one or more phenomena we associate with terrorism. Okay? Anything else? Yes, Quinn.
When is the cutoff point for our notes?
I'm going to leave those up for a while. I won't make a cutoff for those until at least until we've met again as a class.
Okay, thank you.
Because sometimes it's just, you just don't have time. It's like, look, let me work on the paper. I kind of have notes. I don't, you know, but I write them out longhand. I'll put them in there later. You know, I just want to get this paper written. But before I close that door, I'll let you know, and that'll be in class.
Thank you.
All right, anything else? Yeah, Quinn.
For the people who presented, if we write on one we presented on, that's for extra credit, right?
That's right.
Okay.
What'll happen there in terms of extra credit is what I do. I've kind of explained this, but I'll do it again. When all the assignments are done, I'm going to take your lowest assignment and throw it out. Okay. If you've done extra credit and you did well on it, I'm going to add that in. Otherwise, I'm just going to average out. So if you do an extra credit, first of all, it shows initiative. It shows that you're trying. But also, if you did well on it, you know, it's going to improve your grade. If you did it but didn't do any better than your normal average, it can't hurt your grade. I won't calculate it as part of your grade if it would bring your grade down. But it's another opportunity for you to kind of lift the grade up. Where maybe, again, some of you really just may not be comfortable presenting. Okay, that's fine. If you're really not comfortable presenting, then you need to let me know so that, you know, we can agree that, you know, I'm not going to expect you to volunteer for any of the presentations, and you'll have to write on all of them. And that's something you don't need to discuss that in class. If that's a personal issue with you and you want to talk to me, you can send me an email. That is sufficient. Then there's a document of it. I keep a separate file for each of my classes of all the email exchanges from that class. Okay. And so that way, if anybody questions it, I can say, no, we made this arrangement and he asked me if he could just do papers and, you know, there. Nobody's getting preferential treatment. I know that it's very difficult for some people to present in class, and it's, you know, I don't have any, you know, as stressful as the times are right now for people, I don't have any interest in adding to that. So if it's going to make you sleep a little easier, if you know you don't have to present, then just let me know. And then that's one less thing for you to worry about. Okay. I think the presentations generally were good today. Did they seem to be helpful to you? Yeah, I think, you know, generally it's a useful thing to hear somebody other than me trying to explain what these articles are trying to say. All right, then I'm going to assume that everyone's ready to go. And I will look forward to looking at the materials you turn in after Sunday. I'm not going to get to them until at least Monday morning. So it's not going to be a mad dash. It takes me a while to grade, but I'll get to those as soon as I can. All right. Any other questions, just email me. All right. I'll see you next week.
Thank you.